The architect of the final solution's logistics clocked in at 9 a.m., filed his paperwork, and went home to dinner. Hannah Arendt sat in a Jerusalem courtroom in 1961, expecting to see a monster, or Noster. She saw instead a man incapable of speaking except in cliches. What she reported, that evil could be banal, ordinary, thoughtless, became the most controversial thesis in 20th century philosophy. This video examines a single question that Arendt could not leave alone. How do ordinary people like us, become participants in systems of absurdity? Two threads will structure what follows. First, can thoughtlessness, the simple refusal to stop and think, be more dangerous than malice? Second, what happens to moral judgment when obedience to rules becomes its own justification? When the fact that something is policy becomes the reason it is right? Adolf Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires in 1960 and brought to trial in Jerusalem. He had coordinated the transportation of millions to the death camps. The trial was broadcast worldwide. The prosecution presented him as a demonic figure, the embodiment of anti-Semitic hatred. Arendt attended as a reporter for The New Yorker. What she observed did not fit the script. Eichmann was not a fanatic. He did not rage. He spoke in the language of middle management, about duty, efficiency, following regulation. He seemed, Arendt wrote, terrifyingly normal. Not stupid, but thoughtless, incapable of seeing the world from any perspective but his own desk. This was the scandal. The man responsible for mechanizing genocide had no ideology to speak of, no grand hatred. Only a devotion to doing his job well. Arendt called this the banality of evil. The phrase provoked fury. Critics accused her of minimizing the Holocaust, of excusing Eichmann. But she was doing the opposite. She was refusing to let the Holocaust be contained by the category of monstrosity, as if only monsters could do such things. If Eichmann was a demon, we could exile the Holocaust to the realm of the incomprehensible. We could say that could never happen here. But if Eichmann was ordinary, a man who could have been your colleague, your neighbor, then the Holocaust becomes a possibility latent in any bureaucratic society. That was the unbearable implication. Not that evil is banal because it is trivial, but that the worst evil can emerge from the most mundane motivation. Carrierism, a desire to please superiors, the comfort of routine. These, Arendt argued, were sufficient to turn human beings into instruments of atrocity. Ask yourself, when was the last time you followed a rule without asking whether the rule itself made sense? Arendt's central claim was that Eichmann's crime was not hatred, but thoughtlessness. He never paused to consider what he was doing. In the life of the mind, she wrote, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. This is not moral relativism. It is something stranger. The recognition that thinking itself, stopping, questioning, doubting, has moral weight. Thoughtlessness is not innocence. It is a kind of self-imposed stupidity, a refusal to inhabit the world as a thinking being. Eichmann could not think because he could only speak in cliches. His language was prefabricated, borrowed, dead. When asked why he did what he did, he answered, "I was following orders," as if that were an explanation rather than an abdication. Can a will that wills only obedience still be called a will? Or has it become something else, a transmission belt for someone else's decisions? Here we arrive at the second thread. What happens when obedience becomes its own morality? In totalitarian systems, Arendt observed, the very concept of morality collapses. What replaces it is legality. The system's rules become the only measure of right. This is not hypocrisy. The functionaries believed they were being good, good meaning obedient, efficient, aligned with organizational goals. Arendt wrote in Eichmann in Jerusalem, "He did his duty. He not only obeyed orders, he also obeyed the law." The law had become genocidal, and so obeying the law became participation in genocide. Yet the cognitive structure remained intact. I follow the rules, therefore I am good. Consider what this means. In a sufficiently organized system, conscience itself can be externalized. The organization does your thinking for you. You do not need to ask, "Is this right?" because the answer has been given in advance by the policy manual, the supervisor, the chain of command. This is why thoughtlessness and bureaucracy are so intimately linked. Bureaucracy is the architecture of thoughtlessness. It distributes responsibility so finely that no one bears it. I merely process the forms. I merely approve the budget. I merely schedule the trains. You might be thinking, but I am not a functionary in a totalitarian state. I do not coordinate trains to death camps. True, but Arendt's question is not, "Are you Eichmann?" It is, "What structures of thoughtlessness do you inhabit? Where in your life do you defer judgment to process? Where do you say it's policy as if that answered the question instead of raising it? What does it mean to work for an institution whose broader purpose you do not understand or agree with, and to do your job well anyway?" Arendt is not offering comfort. She is diagnosing a condition, the ease with which ordinary moral intuitions can be suspended when embedded in organizational life. The systems you inhabit are not Nazi German, but they contain, in miniature, the same mechanisms. Diffusion of responsibility, the substitution of procedure for judgment. What Arendt saw in Eichmann was not an exception. It was a type, the loyal employee, the man who takes pride in doing what he is told. And the worst of it, he was not lying when he claimed no personal animosity. He genuinely could not see the human beings on the other end of his logistics. We return now to the two threads. First, can thoughtlessness be more dangerous than malice? Arendt's answer was yes. Malice is rare. Thoughtlessness is everywhere. It requires no conviction, no courage, no passion, only inattention. Second, what happens when obedience becomes its own morality? The self disappears. You become a function. Arendt refused to call Eichmann a monster because calling him a monster would have let the rest of us off the hook. The question she left us is not whether we would resist a totalitarian regime. It is whether